Now, let's try to understand the Greeks from the perspective of the derivatives. As such, in the derivative world, when I use the word Greeks, I am talking about the sensitivity. The sensitivity of the price of a derivative when some underlying factor is changing. Underlying factor changes, by what extent the price of the derivative is going to change. So, the prime intention of looking at different Greeks, with respect to different factors, we talk about different Greeks. The main intention is understand the different risks that are there. Sensitivity is more to do with the risk. So it helps us in typically understanding the different risks that are there in the portfolio and formulate a strategy to mitigate these risks, to manage these risks. So the understanding of the Greeks helps a lot as a part of the risk management process, especially when we are dealing with the derivatives as a part of the trading portfolio. There are different kinds of Greeks which are very commonly used. The most commonly used ones are delta, the gamma, the Vega, very heavily used. But yes, apart from them, we even have rho, theta, as well as lambda. So, of course, there are even quite a few more. But yes, these are relatively more commonly used compared to the other tricks. Now, each of these is talking about the sensitivity of the price of the derivative with respect to a change in one of the factors that is impacting the price of this derivative. Probably the best thing is I look at it with respect to the option. We know that option price is changed, option price is impacted by the change in the underlying asset price. Option price is impacted by the change in the strike price. Option price is impacted by the change in the risk-free rate of return, by the change in the volatility or the standard deviation of the security. The option price is impacted by time to maturity. Option price is impacted even by the dividends that are typically declared. So these are the typical 6 different factors that impact the price of the call option or the put option. Now, if any one of these change, probably if we see the price of the underlying stock can change quite drastically. It's very uncertain. Even the strike price can change. The risk-free rate of return during the period of the derivative can very well change. Sigma can change, which is the volatility of the security. The time to maturity, with the passage of every day, the time to maturity is going to change. And the dividends that are typically being paid, even they are going to be changed. So, all we are trying to see is if any one of these is getting changed and keeping other factors as constant, initially to start with, if one of them is changing and all others are constant, these sensitivities are represented by these different Greeks. Just to understand, delta talks about the change in the price of the derivative. The change in the price of the derivative, here I am assuming f is the price of the derivative, change in the price of the derivative by the change in the stock price or the underlying asset price, and that is called delta. Change in the price of the derivative with respect to the change in the volatility of the underlying asset, called as Vega. Change in price of the derivative with respect to the change in the risk-free rate of return, rho. change in price of the derivative with respect to time to maturity, theta. Change in price of the derivative with respect to the change in the continuous dividend that are getting declared, lambda. Then we also have change in price of the derivative with respect to the change in delta. With respect to the price, with respect to the change in delta. So to what extent the change in delta comes if the price changes, because delta may not be constant throughout. So the rate of change of delta with respect to change in price is typically called as gamma. So these are the very commonly used Greeks which help us in managing the risk in the portfolio quite effectively. And I can compute these things. There are various mechanisms to compute. One, we can have it as the numerical methods kind of mechanisms to compute these. Or if I rely on a portfolio, on a formula like Black-Scholes option pricing formula, I can do the differentiations, I can do these kind of calculations on the Black-Scholes option pricing formula and typically derive at the formulas for computing these values. Whatever is the mechanism that we are using for their computation, let's try to understand some important aspects of them. Delta, typically used as a mechanism in delta hedging strategy. The way we are using it in risk management is primarily we are using for the purpose of delta hedging. And this is for an individual security. Now, even if I have a portfolio, like this 5 different securities, I have it as a portfolio. What we are trying to say is the delta of the portfolio is the weighted sum of the deltas of all the individual securities that are a part of that portfolio. So it's a simple arithmetic weighted summation which is deriving the value of the portfolio. Now, when I am saying delta hedging, the intention is choose the combination of the underlying securities plus derivatives. Choose the combination of underlying securities plus derivatives, long or short positions, buy or sell kind of positions in such a way that you make the overall delta being zero, which means the portfolio really does not change even if the underlying security changes a little bit. Even if the underlying price of the security changes a little bit, the value of the derivative or the value of the portfolio of derivatives really does not change. But what we really see in the real world is the delta hedging, making a delta close to zero, is possible only in a very short run. Only for a very instantaneous or a very short time period, and that too for a very small change in the price. If the price changes by let's say 0.1%, probably it's fine. Whereas if the price changes by 1%, delta may not be sufficient. Delta hedging may not be making the overall risk of the portfolio completely zero. So what requires is, as a part of the delta hedging, I may have to rebalance the portfolio always. As a part of the delta hedging, I may have to rebalance the portfolio. Now, how do I create a simple delta hedge? If you look at it, I purchase by delta number of shares. By delta number of shares. and sell one call option, which is having a delta of delta. Now what is happening? Because I have bought delta number of shares, my delta of this, for each share the delta is 1. So because I have delta shares, the delta is delta. And I have sold one call option. So because I have sold, the position is having a negative delta. And the delta of it is delta. So the delta of one call option is delta. Overall, the delta of the portfolio is 0. I can think of so many such kind of mechanisms to make the portfolio delta neutral. But now what we are saying is, now this delta, the call options delta, might become delta plus X for a very large change in the underlying price. This may not be remaining at delta, this may be slightly more than delta or slightly less than delta if the stock price changes quite drastically, if the underlying price changes quite drastically, which means buying delta shares to hedge this particular portfolio or to hedge this particular security may not be a sufficient exercise at all. I may have to either buy more shares or less shares to typically rebalance this portfolio. And that is where we talk about a dynamic rebalancing. Dynamically, I will go into buying of more shares, selling of more shares to make sure that my overall portfolio is delta neutral. So this kind of a mechanism is a delta hedging, or probably we call it as dynamic delta hedging. If I just one time I make my portfolio delta neutral, I'm calling it as delta hedging. But if I'm continuously rebalancing my portfolio or the security to make sure that delta keeps very close to 0 always, it is being termed as dynamic delta hedging for me. Now, so the delta hedging, it is typically otherwise called as instantaneously risk-free. The reason being, for a very short period of time, we can predict the value with certainty. If we know the value of the portfolio at time t, we can very well predict the value of the portfolio at time t plus delta t being very, very small. So because I can predict this with very much of certainty for a very short period of time, we call that the delta hedged portfolio is instantaneously risk free. But as the time period keeps increasing, as the change in the price of the security is very high, then probably delta also keeps changing on a dynamic basis. And because the delta also keeps changing, we are trying to measure the change or the sensitivity of delta. By what extent the delta is changing with respect to the change in the underlying securities price. And that is what we are calling as gamma. So probably I can look at it as the change in delta with respect to the change in the underlying price. Or the other way I can look at is the change, the dou squared f, which is the change in the price of the derivative by dou s squared. And the same way, even when I am doing it for a portfolio, it's simply the weighted sum of the gammas of the individual assets in the portfolio. Now, just like we are doing delta hedging, we also get into a gamma hedge, because it's not sufficient for me to typically make my portfolio delta neutral. Delta neutral is going to protect your portfolio only for small changes in the price, right? Only for small changes in the price, delta neutrality is going to protect your portfolio. But if you have to make your portfolio protected against even larger changes in the price of the security, then it has to be made gamma hedged as well. So I have to make sure that the gamma of the portfolio also is very close to zero. And again, because even the gamma can keep changing, we are trying to rebalance the portfolio at frequent intervals of time to make sure that the gamma is always close to zero. Again, that is involved in the dynamic gamma hedging portfolio. And from the gamma, if the gamma is very high, then it means that the delta of your portfolio is very sensitive, right? A high gamma means delta is very sensitive, a low gamma means delta is very insensitive, because gamma is nothing but the change of delta, sensitivity of delta. That is what is being brought about by gamma. So if the gamma is positive, or if the gamma is very high, then I see that the delta is very high. It is sensitive to, sorry, it's not high, it is sensitive. The change in the delta is very high, sensitive to the change in the underlying assets price, which means frequent rebalancing is required to make it delta neutral. Whereas if my gamma is much lesser, it's as good as delta is more or less constant. If the gamma is much less, then probably delta is more or less constant, which means my portfolio does not require too much of rebalancing to make it delta neutral. So how often my portfolio or security needs to be rebalanced to make it delta neutral is what is being given by just by looking at the value of gamma. So my intention always will be to reduce the gamma to a large extent. Make sure, can I make the gamma very close to zero? Because the moment I am able to make my gamma close to zero, it brings about the insensitivity of the delta to the changes in the price of the underlying, which offers protection to my portfolio in almost every circumstance with very little rebalancing. But if the gamma ends up to be much higher, it's a clear indication that I have to rebalance my portfolio quite often in order to mitigate the overall risk of the portfolio. Now, similarly, just on the same lines as delta and gamma, we also have the Vega as we have earlier defined. It is the sensitivity of the price of the derivative with respect to the change in the volatility of the underlying asset. And for the portfolio, I can very well look at it as a weighted sum itself. Now, if the Vega is very small, means the sensitivity with respect to the volatility is much lesser. Which means even if I am not accurately estimating the sigma, also, it is fine. First of all, let's appreciate that in the pricing of the derivatives, the underlying security price, it is observed. Strike price, it can be observed. Risk-free rate of return, observed. Time to maturity, observed. From the real data, Q, the dividends, it is observed. But the volatility, it is not observed. It is estimated from the data. It is not an observed quantity. So even if the Vega is very small, I really don't bother, even if I did not use a sophisticated mechanism to observe or to compute the volatility. But if the Vega is very, very high, I have to be very careful about it. So Vega is a very clear risk management tool for me. Keeping it low always will ensure that the sigma, even if it is not that accurate, I can still go ahead with my derivatives hedging mechanisms. And let's understand the sigma also keeps changing over time. So if this changes also, I really want to make sure that my Vega is as small as possible so that even the changes in the volatility at different points in time owing to different reasons, it does not impact the value of my portfolio directly and drastically. So we have to really see how much is the Vega, and based on that, I can even get into a Vega hedging kind of a strategy as well, right? Now, just on the same lines, there are quite a few other derivatives, though the first three are very important, delta, gamma, and Vega. But we also have rho, which talks about the sensitivity of the price of the derivative with respect to the risk-free rate of return. Right, risk-free rate of return typically associated with the return associated with the government securities. And let we also know that this is an observed quantity, and to a large extent it doesn't change too much. It is having infrequent changes only once in a while, right? Probably when the central bank is coming out with its monetary policies, or in very few occasions in a year we see that the R is going to change, and even if it changes, the change is going to be very, very small, probably 25 basis points at the max, or even sometimes very high. Very rarely it may go up to 50 basis points, but the not more than that would be the typical change, and that too majority of the derivatives are short term. So within a very small period of time, the change may not be drastic more than that. So that's the reason we always see the rho, which is the sensitive, which is a measure of the sensitivity of the derivative with respect to the risk-free rate of return, generally will be much, much lesser itself. But whatever is that number, if I can even reduce it, which means even if the underlying risk-free rate of return is changing, my portfolio is pretty much insensitive to that. I will not lose or gain drastically because of the change in the risk-free rate of return. And the same logic goes into the computation of theta, which talks about the sensitivity of the price of the derivative with respect to the time to maturity. And this is one variable which is known with certainty. Probably the stock price, it can change in an uncertain manner, right? Risk-free rate of return can change in an uncertain manner. We can't give with 100% assurance. Volatility can keep changing. The dividend rate can keep changing. But what I could clearly see is the time to maturity is known with certainty. How many more days? And every day it advances by 1 day, means the time to maturity typically goes down by 1 day. So because we know this, and there is not much of uncertainty that is built into it, generally we do not get into theta hedging. Only where something is uncertain and we really don't know how it is going to move, that is where we are getting into a hedging strategy. Whereas when we know the time is going to change on a day-to-day basis, it doesn't really make any kind of a sense to hedge the portfolio against the change in the time, because there is no uncertainty that is built into it. Similarly, if I am looking at lambda, I am talking about the sensitivity of the price of the derivative with respect to the continuous dividend yield. Sensitivity of the price of the derivative with respect to the continuous dividend yield. And what we see is over a small period of time, which is the typical maturity period of the derivative, the dividend yield is more or less stable. And because the dividend yield is more or less stable, it's very rare that this changes drastically, and which means the lambda is also more or less stable. So we are not that much bothered about making the portfolio lambda neutral as well. So the generally used trading strategies go with making the portfolio delta hedge, gamma hedge, and Vega Hedge. These three are the very serious kind of sensitivities. They affect the value of the portfolio quite drastically. So, trying to make the portfolio neutral or insensitive to each of these values is one of the important exercises in risk management by understanding the various Greeks. All right.